Hey, everybody, this is Maha,
And this is Dylan.
and we're the hosts of That Wasn't Too
That
Hard.
wasn't too hard.
I love how we never sync, by the way. This is just perfect. In today's episode, we're talking about root cause analysis, aren't we, Dylan?
Heck yes.
So, well, heck yes, I agree. But what is root cause analysis, anyways?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, let's get into some of those tools. So we've mentioned 5 whys a bunch. This is like the oldest trick in the book. It's probably 6,000 years old. But you in a group setting or just within yourself, you say, why? And why? So you start with the problem. Well, why is that problem? And then you say, well, because this. And then you ask why again. And then you ask why again. And people in the therapy space, like this is probably a no-brainer for you because you do this like 8-10 hours a day.
Mm-hmm.
But the Japanese and Toyota production system, it's an official term and a buzzword, and it's a big thing when you're solving problems in the workplace. So 5 whys. Ask why at least 5 times,
At least.
to try to get to that root cause that's causing the thing that you don't like. Often, and this is a second major tool that
Mm-hmm.
often comes from asking why 5 times, is what we call an Ishikawa or fishbone diagram.
Yes.
Where you start with the problem on the one end, and then as you ask why, you usually end up with like more than one why, more than one cause. And so you get this kind of a tree structure. And so if you imagine, if you had like a dead fish and it was just the bones left, you'd have the head on one end, which is the problem that
Probably stinks as much as the problem, by the way.
Say it again.
Probably stinks as much as the problem, by the way.
It probably stinks as much as the problem, yes. And then as you go down the spine, you've got these like outputs, right? Mm-hmm. Which are kind of root causes. And then as you work your way down with whys, you generate more and more and more root causes that kind of contribute to this total problem that you're trying to solve.
And isn't that when you use, I forgot the name of the diagram as well, where you have the root causes planned out and you almost have a percentile of probability for them?
That is super helpful too, Pareto charts.
Yes.
But that depends on figuring out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's talk about current state analysis first, which is the next great idea. Good point. So current state analysis is you're going to quantify, okay, from these root causes we figured out in our fishbone or our 5 whys or something. Well, of the total, and maybe you collect, here's how many times the problem happened in a month, maybe 2 months, I don't know. Mm-hmm. What is the breakdown of how often the problem happened because of this root cause, 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 and you get like a statistically meaningful sample. So I don't know, 30, at least 30 iterations of this problem. And usually it's like hundreds, right? Because you're talking about a factory or some kind of business process.
Mm-hmm.
Help tickets, right?
Yeah, and sometimes just putting it out there actually even helps skew people to kind of realize what these problems are, and it starts kind of clicking.
Right. And so what you do with this, once you assign the root cause, you figure out the root cause. How did this problem happen this time? Is you add them up and you say, well, which of the root causes contributed the most to the number of problems we had, or whatever metric you're interested in reducing.
Yep.
And then you arrange them. That's the current state analysis, just like finding out how this problem shows up and in what frequencies. So current state analysis. Mm-hmm. And then, which is your point, you can use that data to show, and this is kind of like the sophisticated version of the 80-20 rule.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, what's cause?
Are we talking about the same 80-20 rule?
Probably.
What is it?
Go ahead.
No, I'm asking, what is it?
The 80-20 rule. Oh, sure. for those not familiar. There's some famous business person back in the 80s that said 80% of your problems are caused by 20% of your customers, right? He was like in a customer service space.
Yeah.
And something like 20% of your revenue is from those, comes from the customers
80% of the
that
customers.
generate 80% of your complaints, something like that.
Okay.
And so this idea that you have this depreciating return of, there are some easy wins and there are some difficult wins, right? Things that don't make as much sense. And so the Pareto diagram is like the statistical version applying to your exact problem within the 80-20 rule. So you add up root cause number one, how many caused that? And it's a lot, right? So you take your biggest causing root cause and you put it right next to the x-axis. And then you take the next biggest root cause and it's less, and it's less and less and less and less. And then at the end, you have like everything else, all other root causes, and it's usually bigger than the second most, because it's like everything else.
Everything else, exactly.
Is non-trivial, right? And so this is what the Pareto diagram says. Just like the 80-20 rule is, you are a fool if you try to address any of the problems that are not the biggest problem. And almost everybody gets this from the picture. And you guys, all you listeners at home, probably got that too. And this is not a foreign concept.
Oh, it's about visualizing the problem more than anything.
It's about visualizing the problem.
That's what I like about it. It's a simple, coherent visualization that everyone can get, including your toddler at home.
My toddler could get it. Your toddler could get it. Everybody's toddler could get it. But you can see how you do have to do a little legwork to be able to present that very simple picture, but it's often worth it. I think there's a huge gap here, though, because while I've talked about, 4 ideas that are very mathy and very concrete, in my experience, frequently, the root cause is not like a tangible one. The root cause is some sort of interpersonal issue, group dynamic, people being grumpy or petty at each other. Maha, what tools, if that's the root cause, and sometimes it is, what do teams do about it? What tools do we have there?
See, this is kind of the interesting piece about it, right? Because there is also here a differentiation between person and role, and then person, role, task as well. So I'm gonna have to kind of take over here, not just because you're asking me, but because there's also this kind of thing that I've experienced in HR, which is, the root cause is Geert, for example, and we just have to fire Geert. Sorry, that's the first Dutch name that kind of popped into my mind. But then you actually have to ask, is Geert actually the problem? Is it just because he's having a bad day? Is it because he's just going through a lot? Maybe that's actually a root cause, by the way. So there's a root cause of a root cause. But then eventually what happens is that when you look at it from an organizational excellence perspective, or from an organizational perspective, Geert may not be the problem. It may actually be the systems supporting them, or the lack of those. It might be the role in itself. Is the role fit for is the person fit for the role? Is the role designed to support the process as well? Because trust me, a lot of people, and you and I, and probably all the listeners can guess that job descriptions are crap, and they're not kind of based on science. They're just based on what people think. Should the job should actually look like, and that's not usually the case. But then you start looking actually at the root cause of the root cause. 90% of the time, I'm going to tell you that it just has to do with the organization more than it has to do with the person. It has to do with the job not being processed well, and it has to do with everything else as well. That is a hard fix. The interesting thing about it is that if Geert was actually the problem, that can be, for example, I'm obviously rectory sourcing the statistics as well, but if that was them, it would be either 10 or 20% of the problem. And it might just actually be fixed with simple recalibration of the role. It might actually be fixed with just giving them the right training. You do not need to fire people. There are cases where you do, but it should always be the last resort, because there are root causes to your root causes in this case too. And this is something I think that we need to touch on as well, right? Because some people would reach the root cause in this case versus when they do a fishbone method, or when they do even when they do a little bit of an error tree, for example, to kind of recognize where the pain points are, right? But you need to understand that that's not the final answer. Don't get lazy. Don't lie to yourself and say that that's the final reason. It's just like AA. It's not, my mother isn't the problem, for example, or something like that, but maybe it's something a little bit deeper than that. So I'm going to throw this back at you of how do you know that you've gone deep enough, Dylan?
Oh, that's hard.
Yes.
I think, and like nobody talks about that question. Just a second.
I did a lot because I ask a lot of questions, which is good for RCA anyways.
Okay, let's restart.
Sorry.
I think that's a really hard question, and nobody really talks about the answer. There are, within like a statistical sense, there are definitely approaches. I will actually reference the Working Backwards book because it's fresh in my mind, but they weren't the first to this. But there's this idea of controllable inputs and then outputs. And it's important to distinguish, well, which things do I actually have control over? And we can affect those. And this is topic for a future conversation, but it's sometimes important here to choose correct metrics, because you need to measure what goes into a process, because sometimes you can't control what comes out, and by choosing your metrics differently, you can optimize the outputs that you're actually looking for. And there's a huge science to that. It goes very deep. I think you can get in a graduate degree in just that topic alone.
And I think I like that answer, because it even touches on why KPIs fail. Right.
Many KPIs are very poorly chosen. You only have to call your insurance provider to know this, because that phone tree is so frustrating, and that the KPIs that they chose to optimize the phone tree 100% focus on reducing call volumes and call length, and do not care about your experience. Classic cases. And people have written great books about this. Google SRE is a wonderful set of books talking about advanced KPI selection within this weird like subculture of building resilient infrastructure and applications. It goes deep, but it's hard.
It is. And I'm going to also kind of circle back with the organizational thing, by the way, too, because I think there are visible reasons that support the RCA, right? There are visible reasons as to why, and controllable reasons, just like you said, for that. When you think about application in organizations as well, there are sometimes, let's call them shadow processes in the background and shadow relationships that actually drive a lot of the issues, because sometimes, that drive a lot of the issues, and sometimes the root cause is the organization itself. And it's kind of funny, because it kind of goes back to this whole thing of the problem is me, and how do I fix it?
Yeah.
Am I paid enough to fix me?
If you're an executive and you have like a team of 200 or 300, and you you can't know everything. There's so much happening that, and you're just like steering a ship that is people holding on to each other, right? The ship is made of people.
Exactly.
And
Irrational people.
How do you find out truth? How do you do root cause analysis? How do you measure their success? How do you determine, like, cut through all that, all the layers of obfuscation for all sorts of different priorities within your organization, Maha?
Well,
give us some solid advice here.
It's funny enough, isn't a lot of solid advice that I can give, because leadership, everything that you've touched on is things that leaders and things that people in the organization that need to support should actually touch on, which is, are we actually measuring against the right metrics? Are we actually putting in the right support networks for our staff? When it comes to even getting the most optimal benefit, do we trust the people or do we trust the process? I think that is something that a lot of organizations even struggle with. Do we trust that the process is good, or do we trust that the people know what to do within the process? But I think that's really a hard thing to answer, to be honest with you. And I think this is something that organizations as a whole ecosystem need to figure out for themselves, just like how Amazon, for example, figured out for themselves. But then inquiry, I would say, being able to ask questions, being able to honestly answer those questions again in safe environments, being able to create this whole idea of how to break groupthink, by the way, because groupthink is, I think, the biggest poison pill that a lot of organizations sometimes miss on, because they confuse groupthink with culture sometimes. You can add systems. Oh, sorry.
Just a second. Pause.
No.
So this question was a lob for, like, groupthink, and I think you're getting there, but groupthink and, like,
at least my brain is getting there.
The network effect, and what was the third one? Oh, you could even talk about assurance, like Putin not knowing that people weren't changing the tires or something like that.
Yeah, we've been trying to talk about that for a while too, right?
Right. So do you
yes, I can.
I fear that you were like deer in headlights by the question, but that's what I was trying to serve you up for.
That's okay. Better? Well, I think you've actually done a great job, and I just definitely was caught off guard with that one, but that's not a bad thing. Because it's right, because this is kind of the thing as well. And financial, if you want to go back to the financial institutions piece, right? In financial institutions, you need hierarchy, and you need a lot of. So let me tell you why it was difficult to answer the question. In institutions where things are, again, processes and systems are set in such a rigid way that it's about assurance. You're going to have hierarchies, and you're going to have between the hierarchies, you're going to have a lot of reporting lines, etc. Right? This works for financial organizations. This works for established organizations. If I want to even think about how that actually goes to tech, the reason why organizational structures that have coexisted for so long, such as banking, for example, fail in the tech industry, is because it just does not give you the same capabilities, and does not give you the same amount of headroom to start asking questions on certain things, because systems are things that change, right? IT systems especially. There's like constant change through them. So if I want to answer the question right, I would say it really depends on the organization and on the industry and product. And I would say that when there are rigid systems that have been proven, there are definitely methods, and there are systems to ensure that we're asking ourselves the right question, i.e. audit. Okay.
Maha, I think you're right. For an executive, though, give us some concrete good approaches for how they can know if their organization is lying to them. What are the hidden parts of what's happening within their teams?
And this is kind of an interesting one too, right? Because on one hand, there is the more tangible or more kind of technical side where you can add assurances, and then you can add a lot of measurements to ensure that the organization is not only quote unquote delivering, but you can even add measurements on there to ensure that the organization is delivering in the right sort of manner, in the right way, through random inspections or through anything else like that. I think one great example that I've learned when I was also working on a plant site again is that the interesting aspect about plants is that you cannot automate these things. Sometimes you can, but you need to have those spot checks. Those spot checks need to be manual, and those spot checks are going to be able to give you exactly the feel of how a plant site is running. Because sometimes your numbers are great. I mean, let's talk about Wall Street. The numbers show up great, and then we got an economic crash because the background, or kind of the shadow operations, if you want to call it, in the background were just building up and building up and building up a lot of lies to just maintain a visible truth. So that's why, as an executive, it's really good for even the executive to just be able to have those spot checks, be able to kind of move through the organization, and to have trusted bodies and trusted processes that can do that for them. Spot checks are really great to do that, for one. Another thing that is like less tangible, I would say, is more about the culture, company cultures. Because if we want to go back to the example with Netflix, right? Netflix did hit rock bottom, but it learned tremendously from it, from a cultural perspective of, you know what? We need to add root cause analyses, and we need to add almost like a radical candor approach to communication. Because if we don't, no one is going to disagree. No one is going to push. And when no one disagrees and no one pushes, you burned. You know, it's just, it's not going to work out. So in a lot of cases, one way to foolproof or poke-yoke your organization is to make sure that you embed systems in the culture itself that help you do that. Another way of doing it is obviously adding systems that support the culture to do that. And one interesting way of doing it is either something like the nominal group technique, where people would vote anonymously on something. And in HR, this is quite popular because this is what you do with your annual not annual reviews, excuse me, but that's how you do the pulse checks in an organization. You send a survey out. You ask people how they're doing, and you ask people whether the job is being done right, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, that has its faults as well, which is kind of funny.
Right. I always find it interesting after those go out, going around the cubes and asking, so you talk about that thing that's been bugging you lately that you told me about? And like nobody ever says yes. They say, nope. They know my IP. They know they know who I am, and they're going to trace it back and get mad at me if I talk about what's wrong.
That's actually what's so great about it too, by the way. I think this is a super awesome point because anonymous, it's true. Like people in the organizations don't trust it. So that's one thing about assurance systems, right? If you have assurance systems put in place, people need to trust them. So if you're inspecting a plant site, people need to trust that you know what you're actually inspecting for. And in this case, with pulse checks and everything else like that, if you're actually sending out pulse checks, people need to trust that you know what you're looking for and that you will support them and will help them. Because guess what? One failure to help in the organization has a tremendous ripple effect, and it's just going to break your systems down eventually, which funny enough is about another thing. As an executive, if you really want to do well, you got to be honest with yourself. If you do get those pulse reports or pulse checks, and if you do get feedback, You got to act on it fast, because if you don't, your whole system, it falls down to the ground, and it's just you're just building a web of lies even for yourself. So sometimes for executives, my feedback, the problem might be you.
Right. Yeah. I think Simon Sinek says those things too. So I think you're in good company. It makes me think, so back to our inputs and outputs question, like what are the inputs that you can control and what are the outputs? That pulse check, that's definitely an output. Yes. What are the things you can control? Man, that's a much harder question. And I think that's probably what you were getting at with the culture and the processes and Netflix's approach.
Culture, processes, leadership.
They can control.
Yeah. So what can you control as an executive? Culture, processes, leadership, and leadership. And again, interesting. I know that you think people cannot be controlled in this case, but also, again, being the chief of truth. That's what you can control. If you're not solving the relevant problems in your organization, you're just lying to yourself. So I think these are the things in your control. You, people, you, culture, and the culture of leadership. Leading by example is another. I know. Okay, so I'm sorry if I'm going on a tangent, but leading by example. No, but it's true. In a lot of cases, leading by example is the number one most effective thing that you can even imagine in an organization sometimes. Right. So being able to address problems yourself will help your organization be able to address problems on their own.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of, and maybe we'll talk about this in a future episode, but there's a lot of perception in executives I've spoken to that they're doing these things, but how do they know whether it's working? Are they leading by example? Well, maybe not. Maybe they're not thinking, maybe they're not noticing that they just cut off some poor sap who barely questioned the vision for this project, and they cut them off at the knees without thinking twice because of that power differential, and no one told them otherwise, and they didn't even think about how that might reduce trust and how they might be lying to themselves about the culture that they're creating.
Yep. And this is something, again, if I kind of think I missed something earlier, which is quintessential and really important, which is the power, which are power dynamics, network effects, and then again, shadow processes in organizations as well. Because as an executive, you're always going to have that, and it's about being able to navigate through that, and being able to, again, identify some of the sources. But I would say that one thing that I thought was interesting about shadow organizations, et cetera, is, again, are you as a leader lying to yourself when you go into these one-on-one meetings, interestingly enough, or those even inspections, by the way. Now, inspections are not only done on a plant site, sometimes inspections are done on an organizational level, being able to remove, I'm going off on a tangent there.
The cybersecurity industry is full of them, man. You have to get audited every year by some big four to justify your budget. It's goofy.
But I like that. I like it for two reasons. Number one, because the big four have failed in their audits of large organizations for very similar reasons to what we were talking about, which is metrics. And on the other hand as well. Anyways, I'm just going to stop my rant because I think I'm a little bit unfocused right now. Well, Dylan, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you all for joining us as well. But we hope that you've enjoyed our content. And don't forget that if you want to hear about more of our rantings, don't forget to click like, subscribe, and follow us on your favorite podcast app. And until then, Dylan, see? That wasn't too hard. We almost rhymed. I love this. Keep it.